Good afternoon, historians and folks of interest in historical matters. Welcome to the every second Tuesday History Pub, sponsored by Downtown Cottage Grove and the Cottage Grove Genealogical Society. My name is Dana Merriday, and I'm filling in for Deborah Monsiv. She recently had some eye procedure done and was not up to appearing today, but sends her regrets. We want to welcome everybody here, and I know some people are still trying to find seats, so if you got a free space and wouldn't mind some neighbors or customers to squeeze in, we're all family here. Thank you. Of course, you find yourself right in the downtown heart, the historic district of Cottage Grove. This is the Burkholder Woods building, second building that was on this site. And it was a dry goods store, very popular for clothing, logging supplies, school supplies, everything. We want to thank the staff here at the Axe and Fiddle for welcoming us, Bart and Seth, the sound person, and Jefferson and Marcia at the bar. They'll do their best with this big crowd, so just be patient and flag them down when you get a chance, and they'll be happy to serve you. Don't forget to tip well. We also want to thank Jim Lockhart, who's recording this for posterity, and you will be able to see it on the Cottage Grove Genealogical Society YouTube page in about 3 weeks or so, when it gets all edited and the slides you'll be seeing will be merged into the presentation. And so if you have a friend that missed it and really wanted to be here, you can tell them it will be available. So I want to talk about the history in Cottage Grove, because not only do we have a rich history, but we also have a rich group of organizations called the Partners of History. And going to run through some of the members, and I do see members from each of the organizations here. We have the Cottage Grove Historical Museum, the Cottage Grove Genealogical Society, the Cottage Grove Historical Society, the Cottage Grove Public City Library, the Bohemia Mining Museum, Singing Creek, and the Oregon Aviation Historical Society. So those are the Partners of History. They meet regularly and conspire to preserve our local history and publicize it and bring it to you. We're going to tonight be hearing about the kidnapping of Georg Weyerhaeuser. He was a young man, heir to the Weyerhaeuser fortune, and presenting will be our Cottage Grove head librarian, Natasha Chitow. And she has worked in libraries ever since 2007. Started with the city in August of 2016, and one of her most favorite and beloved aspects of her work is informational literacy, helping people with their reading, research needs, and sharing joy and wonder about learning together. So without much further ado, I will turn it over to her to give the presentation. I do encourage you to listen carefully, because there will be some trivia at the end. So listen for details that might make good trivia questions. We'll make sure that if you don't have the sheets enough for your table before the trivia, we'll get them redistributed to make sure anybody that wants to be in on the trivia will get an answer sheet. There's also the chance to participate in the 50-50 raffle. So if you need tickets, flag Ruth Linos down, who's representing downtown Cottage Grove, and you can get in on the the chance to win half of the pot, whatever it turns out to be. So the more people that play, the better the chance for a big pot. So without further ado, the kidnapping of Georg Weyerhaeuser.
As mentioned before, my name is Natasha Chitow. I am the head librarian for the city of Cottage Grove, and one of the reasons why I picked the story of the kidnapping of Georg Weyerhaeuser is partly because we do have Weyerhaeuser land nearby, but also it was a really interesting story. I don't know how many of y'all are familiar with, but we do have a copy of Deep in the Woods at the library. This is my own review copy that I was annotating from when I was starting my research for this particular program. And we'll start out with giving you a little bit of context. So all of this started in 1935, so we're going to talk about what was going on in the 1930s. So in the middle of the 1930s, we were dealing with the Great Depression. Before FDR had been elected president and created the New Deal in 1933, there were no social services. If you were going hungry, there wasn't help unless you were able to find a soup kitchen or a stranger who was willing to feed you. Organized crime and kidnapping were the norm back then, primarily because so many people were unemployed. It was just under 25% unemployment rate back then. Yeah, so factories were closing down, people were losing their farms, their homes. The Dust Bowl was occurring because of over-farming. The Midwest, and specifically cotton, is really, really bad with sucking up all the nutrients from the soil. Additionally, meanwhile in Germany, they were paying reparations for World War I. Hitler came to power as a chancellor in 1933, and in the same year he introduced the Nuremberg laws, which were the laws restricting Jewish people to specific neighborhoods, requiring that they're wearing certain badges to identify themselves, etc. They weren't the only people that were subject to these laws in Germany. And additionally, in the Soviet Union, between 1930 and 1933, they had their grain harvests fail across the board. So people were starving, and then, of course, Stalin was in charge, and he decided that this was the perfect time to start purging old Bolsheviks within the Communist Party. So, this is where things start getting really hairy all over the world. In 1930, Clarence Birdseye had invented a method to flash freeze food so that you could keep food fresh longer without canning or drying, and for distribution. And the 1930s is when talkies become more common within the film industry. So it's a transitional period. They're using a lot of the current events as fodder for scripts, and that is actually why we have so many tropes that are directly related to 1930s gangsters. So in 1924, J. Edgar Hoover became the first director of the Bureau of Investigation, which became the FBI in 1935. He was 28 years old when this happened. 28. I wasn't in charge of anything at that age. So, that's pretty impressive. And he was given this honor by Calvin Coolidge. In 1932, the U.S. government printing service had published a manual called How to Take Fingerprints. The reason why I have this in context is because fingerprint in use on crime scenes and investigations were still really, really new. 1912 was the year that one of the prisons within the United States was the first one to start recording people's fingerprints and standardizing what they would look like. Later on, this would become a network of shared fingerprints, so people were able to identify folks who changed their name, moved to another town, and created a new life for themselves. In 1932, we had the Lindbergh kidnapping. Unfortunately, this is, it's a more famous kidnapping, and it's one that didn't end well. Unfortunately, the Lindbergh baby was found, but not alive. And the trial began on January 3rd, 1935, so the same year that most of this stuff is happening. And as I mentioned, FDR had created a whole bunch of different programs and social services. This is where Social Security comes from. This is where you get in the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Works Progress Administration, etc. Rural farm stability was in that as well. It was all about trying to save people's livelihoods in a time where everybody was doing poorly, for the most part. So to give you context on the Weyerhaeuser family, we are going to start with Frederick. So he is on the right-hand side. He is George's great-grandfather, and he's the founder of Weyerhaeuser. He moved over here as a young man from Germany, and he was professionally trained as a brewer, and he decided that was not his best career choice now that he was in the New World, and he decided he was going to work in logging and start a business that way. And to give you context for how wealthy he was when he was alive, if you look at the list of the wealthiest people in the United States for all time, Frederick is 12th. The person that is even wealthier than him in position number 11 is Bill Gates. And Bill Gates is still alive. So he was kind of a different breed from a lot of the extremely wealthy families that were in the United States. First of all, he's on the West Coast. Second of all, he's not flashing how much money he has. He's not the Astors. He's not the Carnegies. He's, he is not the Vanderbilts. He's not a railroad baron. He is a man who revolutionized the lumber industry, and he didn't believe in showing off what wealth he made, but he did make sure that future generations could succeed within his family. He's providing jobs and infrastructure, and also, incidentally, I found out this week that they have a chair of environmental studies at Yale that is specifically named after this family. So they originally, his son had gone to Yale to study environmental studies, and specifically in regard to forestry, and due to their wealth they were able to actually have more of the family go to Yale as a result. And then in the center, we have JP. So that is John Paul Weyerhaeuser. This is George's father. He was, I think, 35 or so when George was kidnapped. He had newly become in charge of Weyerhaeuser at the time, and they lived in a more modest home than his father had. The house that they had in Tacoma was a large house, but it was not ostentatious. And then on the left, we have George, and he is our protagonist for today. He's 9 years old, and he's a smart kid. He's generous. He's really curious about, about things. And his favorite sport was soccer at the time. So we're going to move on to the next set of characters. So we have 3 people who are involved in the kidnapping. We have William Daynard. He's 32 years old at the time that they're organizing. He had met Harmon Whaley when they were both in Idaho. So I'm going to call him Bill. He's had lots of aliases, including the one that he used for this particular kidnapping with Harmon and Margaret was Swede. So he's got all these crazy aliases. So Harmon, in contrast, is 23. And while they met in the Idaho Penitentiary, he started out his life of crime in juvie. So he's much younger. He's convinced Margaret, who is a 19-year-old Mormon girl who lives in Salt Lake City, and he convinces her to marry him. She's convinced, I can change him. He's going to be on the straight and narrow. The things we think as idealists, when we're younger. We don't always make good decisions at 19. So the third set is the Bureau. So in the center, we've got J. Edgar Hoover. This is what he looked like around the time of the kidnapping. It's a few years prior. C.C. Spears was the special agent in charge of the Seattle office, and he was one of the main investigators there. But Hoover also sent E.J. Connolly, who is a special agent in charge of the Cincinnati office, and he was a particular favorite of Hoover. He's actually the only person in the force that he allowed to grow a mustache. Everybody else had to be clean shaven. They had to be as nondescript as possible. And keeping up appearances was really, really important to Hoover, which, he's kind of a mixed bag. He was breaking up corruption, but he also created a lot of it too. For context, I'm sure that at least a few of these names are going to be familiar to y'all. We have Al Capone, who ended up in Alcatraz after being charged for tax evasion, because it was the easiest way to prosecute for him. And then we had the Barker and Karpus gang, so that's Alvin Karpus, Ma Barker. We have Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker, otherwise known as Bonnie and Clyde. They ended their criminal streak about a year before all of this happened. You have the Brady gang, you have John Dillinger, you have George Machine Gun Kelly, you have Lester Gillis, who is also known as Babyface Nelson, and you have Charles Arthur, who's also known as Pretty Boy Floyd. So all of these people were creating so many wild tropes that we see in movies that are about detective work and solving crimes and gangsters and just all sorts of things that were part of popular culture, but also have continued to be tropes within our modern media. So, as I mentioned earlier, crime was really, really prevalent in the 1930s. You have just under 25% unemployment in 1933. Many Americans lost everything in the stock market crash in 1929 and the resulting bank runs. Banks would have lines going out the door of people trying to cash out their entire account. Because banks don't hold every last cent that they take in for deposits, they would run out of money before everybody was through with the lines. And if they were out of money, you were out of luck. Factories are closing, farms are lost to foreclosure. You see a lot of hunger. You see a lot of migrant labor. That's the norm. So people who are leaving the Dust Bowl, especially those who were from Oklahoma, were moving across the country, specifically a lot of the time to California, because there was a lot of farm work to be had, or at least that's what they heard. And it wasn't an easy job. In addition to that, they started having the shanty towns, so were made from scrap material and vehicles as they were passing along, and they ended up getting called Hoovervilles because it was reflecting the poverty that everyone was experiencing at the time. And as I said, desperate people are going to do what they can to make sure that they have a place to live, that they have food, and maybe they're going to get a few extra dollars to be able to do something with. And there weren't any social services. If you were able to get help from a stranger or a church, that was great. There weren't a lot of food kitchens back then. I had mentioned the Lindbergh Law. So because there had been so many kidnappings before then, and because the Lindbergh kidnapping was so severe, there was a federal law created that made it a crime punishable by the death sentence, but in particular, it usually only applied if people cross state lines. So keep that in mind. And the kidnapping we're talking about is the 27th kidnapping that occurred since that law got enacted. So people are super, super lawless back then. And so as I was doing research, I was going, what is a 19-year-old Mormon girl doing with these men? You know, it's wild. You have people who have made their living by breaking the law and being con men, and unfortunately, poor Margaret, she got convinced that she was going to be able to have this wonderful, quiet life with a husband who'd take care of her, even though he didn't have any money, and who had gotten out of jail somewhat recently after, before they had met. So we're going to start with the crime timeline. So May 24th of 1935, around 11:45 a.m., George gets released from his class at Lowell School for lunch. It's about 15 minutes earlier than he usually leaves. His sister Anne was still in class over at the Anarite Seminary that's on the way home. And because these kids are very wealthy, they have a family chauffeur. The family chauffeur usually picks them up, brings them home for lunch, drives them back. The major reason is because of the fact that they are both wealthy and notable people within the area. So they're trying to prevent exactly what's going to happen. So before this day, a week prior, Harmon Whaley and Bill Daynard are scoping out the area and seeing how he's passing through and what his timeline habits are. And they figure out day of, they are going to hang out in between the Anarite Seminary and the tennis courts that are nearby. So they do so in an old black Buick, and Bill comes up to him and goes, "Hey, can I ask you directions to this?" Pretending that he actually needs the directions, and ends up picking up George and just shoving him into the car. And so on this way, he ends up getting blindfolded. They take him out to an area of clear-cut forest land in Issaquah, which is not terrifically far from Tacoma, and they lowered him into a pre-dug pit in the ground. And what they did to keep him there is they actually shackled his ankles and chained him to a board that was down at the bottom. So this is in late May. It's really cold outside if you're not wearing sweaters or anything and you're stuck in the forest overnight. So despite the fact that this was unpleasant, he was in good spirits for at least part of the time. Now, same day, we see that there is a ransom note that gets delivered to the Weyerhaeuser residence at 6:25 p.m. It's hand typed. It's kind of rambly, as you can see. We've got the all caps rant at the bottom. They requested $200,000. That's 4 times the amount that the Lindbergh kidnapper had asked for. And it's equivalent to just under $4.4 million today. And they also give different rules for how they are going to deal with the ransom, with communication, etc. They mention how many $20 bills, how many 10, how many 5. They want them to be unmarked. They don't want law enforcement to be involved. They tell them, don't tell the press, don't have us followed. It's gonna be bad for you if you don't follow the rules. It's gonna be bad for someone else. You know, they don't specifically mention George, but we know that's who they're talking about. And then they sign it off with egoist. So, you know, we're talking about amateurs. This is weird. So, in context, at the time, the press and the FBI are kind of at opposite ends for how to deal with this. The press wants to get the scoop. They are there specifically to give people information, but to also be entertaining. This is the 1930s. We don't have TV. Radio is available in some places. Electricity isn't everywhere yet. And so the newspaper and magazines are a big part of how people are getting information. And this is also a time period that the FBI Forensics Lab in Washington, D.C. is relatively new. It's less than 10 years old around this time. And additionally, crime scene investigations are a hot mess. So it's not just criminals doing dumb stuff, but everybody involved. This is kind of a comedy of errors. So I don't know how many of y'all are familiar with some of the true crime stories from the 20s and 30s, but they didn't have proper procedures for not contaminating evidence. You would have the press coming in, stomping all over the area, smoking cigarettes, putting them out right in the middle of the crime scene. In this case, with the ransom note, not only had most of the family handled it with reading it, the press did. They had to get fingerprints of everybody who could have touched this to be able to rule them out. And fingerprinting technology was not amazing back then. Up until very recently, it had all been visual analysis. Back in the late 1800s, there was a guy who actually wrote a handbook for describing how the fingerprints are lined up, like the different shapes that the whorls and the stripes make on your fingers, and how to indicate which fingers, location, etc. So nothing's truly professional in this time period. Everybody's messing around. So I mentioned marked notes earlier, and just in case, I decided I was going to go over it. So a marked note isn't physically marked on the banknote. It's actually, what they do is law enforcement will make a list of all the serial numbers that are on each banknote. If you look at them, usually at that time there were letters that started and then a series of numbers. So if they make a list of it, they can then have it in order, preferably consecutive numbers so it's easier. So a professional ransom note would usually tell you non-consecutive, non-marked bills to make it a little harder to trace them. These guys didn't think about that. But so the FBI ended up having to get through this. They had an entire team copying down every serial number on every bill and what denomination it was on, getting them all in order on index cards, and then having it typed and proofread and then sent through a mimeograph. to make 100,000 copies of 20,000 numbers. So during all of this time, it took over 4,200 hours just to get it together. And they had 5 days to get the money together and ready for delivery. So, you know, it's a lot of money. How are they going to get it all? But yeah, so as I said before, they keep making mistakes. The next day, after Bill has been watching George in the pit overnight, Harmon makes his wife get up at 3 a.m. to cook him breakfast and wake him up so he can drive over to the hiding spot. And he doesn't tell Margaret anything. She has no idea what's going on. So he drives over, he sees that there's another car parked on site. He gets a little worried about what they need to do. So they realize, yeah, I'm going to drive back to the house and figure out how to meet up with Bill when they're gone, and we gotta move him to a new site. So that's what they ended up doing. So they moved him from a little outside Issaquah to Yakima. So Bill had dug a second pit out in Yakima just in case they needed to move him. And while Bill and Harmon had actually traded spots, so Harmon was the person guarding, and he noticed that there were a whole bunch of airplanes flying overhead. And the more he heard and saw those airplanes, the more paranoid he got. They had airplanes that they referred to as spy eyes, and they are specifically, it's an airplane that in the floor, it has a telescope that is mounted in, so you have an agent literally like peering over the telescope to look down at the ground to try to identify what they're looking for. So with, you know, it's par for the course. Technology is kind of oddball back then. You know, they did what they could with the resources they had. So Bill hears about this. He picks up Margaret in Seattle, who is staying in an apartment that they rented, and he drives out towards Spokane. And on the way, he goes to pick up Harmon out in Yakima. So he's trying to be secretive. They're trying to keep her from knowing about any of the stuff that's going on. So they tell Margaret, here, like, put this coat over your head and like bend over in the front seat. We're gonna like tilt the seat back. And then they go and pull George out of the pit, and they put him in the trunk itself. I don't know if y'all have seen trunks on cars from the 1930s. It's like trying to put a 9-year-old in an ice chest. You end up having to fold them up to get them to fit. So they're driving east. They are headed toward the state lines, and Margaret, of course, is like, what is going on? And they, you know, of course, they're like, you don't need to know. And then all of a sudden, there's this voice that comes out of the trunk and goes, can I get out, mister? And of course, Margaret's going, I don't know whether I should say anything. Like, I don't know if I heard that. Like, and they have a discussion about plausible deniability and just don't tell her who it is. So, meanwhile, back at the Weyerhaeuser residence, they respond to the ransom letter with an ad in the personal section of the Seattle Post-Intelligencer. They're following directions. Once they have all the money together, they say, hey, it's ready, Percy Mini. And because the FBI is following every single lead they get, from people who are trying to be helpful, people who think they're doing their civic duty, to people who are grifters, crackpots, they all have wild ideas. And one of them was trying to figure out why Percy Mini was the fake name for the Weyerhaeusers within the ads. They never came up with anything. But the Weyerhaeuser family decided that they were not going to tell Grandma. George's grandmother Cleo happened to be, she was older, she was in poor health, she had just gotten over an illness. And they went, we don't want to stress her out, we don't want her to get sick because she's stressed out, so we're just not going to tell her what's going on. And they make up this story about why their entire front lawn is covered in reporters. Yeah. So they tell her, hey, oh, this is because of the lumber strikes that are going on right now. It wasn't just Weyerhaeuser, it was the entire lumber industry in the Pacific Northwest was dealing with labor strikes, which was really, really common at the time. The first 30, 40 years of the 20th century were full of labor strikes in order to get workers' rights to be lined up with what we have today. So, as I said, you know, the Whaleys and Daynard had to get George out of sight. So, in context, we have an example of that 1930s car trunk. You can see this is not George, this is a recreation, and he barely fits in here. It's kind of deep, very, very narrow. And the pit could have looked like this when it was uncovered in the middle of the woods. It would have blended in, you know, it's something that you would have seen a bit in that part of the Puget Sound area. And sneak preview, they did end up moving George again from the pits, and they moved out to Hobart, and they rented a place in order to make that happen. So, as I said, Margaret doesn't know what's going on with her husband and with her husband's acquaintance. She just knows they're being weird, and the more that she gets to know Bill, who keeps taking her to go drive places without her husband, which seems suspicious to her, the more she is scared of Bill. He's bigger, he's taller, he's older, he knows how to mean mug people. So he thoroughly has her scared of protesting in any way whatsoever. So within here, to give you all context for how far out they went, I have mapped out where they started. So if you look at the little orange house, they started out in Tacoma, and then the green walking area is where George ended up being found. A little bit above that is actually where they were hiding him, and for the first hiding spot. They wander out to Yakima to pick him up. They head out towards Spokane. This is where they end up renting a house, but what happens is that Harmon and George end up out near, they end up in Idaho, like just over the border. So if you, so actually, if you see just below Newport and above Coeur d'Alene and Post Falls, they ended up out here. There is a lake that they were at while traveling back and while waiting for Bill and Margaret to rent out this house. He got chained to a tree for several hours. So they're hanging out, they're having, the weirdest picnic on the planet, and just waiting, and Bill not being there, Harmon actually gets to be a fellow human being and a community member with this little boy that he's helped kidnap. Now, as I said, Harmon's about a decade younger than Bill is. He doesn't really know what he's doing. He's in over his head. He just wants to get it over with. So once the house is rented, what they do is they drive him back. They set up one of the closets as his next place. I guess apparently they had some sort of walk-in closet that they were able to put a whole bed in there. There was a light. They had, a bucket and a pitcher of water. so that they could lock him in there for long periods of time. So Harmon's job for the next few days is to camp out with George in this house while he waits for Bill and Margaret to be done. Meanwhile, there's a second letter that comes to the house, and our father, J.P. Weyerhaeuser, ends up being instructed to stay at the Ambassador Hotel in Seattle to await further instructions. The reason why? It gets him closer to being able to get messages, and a lot of the ransom instructions kind of worked like a really morbid scavenger hunt back then. So he gets the second letter. It gives him instructions to go out and drive out to this area, and he is told to look for little white flags or strips of fabric on sticks. And then once he finds those sticks, to find a can that's going to have a message in it. The message leads him to another can that's supposed to have another message. But the message wasn't there. So they messed up again, whether it's through user error or random squirrels stealing their paper. It's not there. He goes back to the hotel, and the next day he gets a phone call, and it's this random guy with like a fake Swedish voice who's like, "You didn't follow my instructions." And then so JP goes, "I didn't find a note. I couldn't find instructions." So the caller goes, "Well, we'll give you another chance tonight." So this gives him another couple of hours to wait before he goes out, and he ends up actually finding the note that gives him specific instructions for where to drive with the ransom money. So all of this is happening. Weyerhaeuser is in the hotel with FBI agents who are fastidiously packing up bags of the ransom money. It was about a 40-pound bag of money. And so he drives out in his car, he stops at the appointed place, he puts on the dome light inside of his vehicle, he turns around, he walks away as instructed. He gets about 100 feet away, and he hears his car drive off with the money. So yeah, it's kind of wild. Yeah, he left it running, and he followed directions. Sometimes when we follow directions, bad things happen, but the Weyerhaeusers could afford to pay for another car. They could afford to pay for another car. It stinks, but it's like, oh, I forgot my bunch of bananas at the grocery store. I'll just buy another set. What could they cost? $10? But so at the same time, Bill and Margaret are back in Seattle. They end up picking up the ransom money. The $200,000, that's more than 133 years worth of the average man's salary in 1935. There is no way that they're going to be able to spend all of this without making some really dumb decisions in the process. So they drive back to what Bill affectionately refers to as the shack in Seattle, and that's the apartment that Margaret was staying in before. He hides the bag in between the wall and the siding, and they end up wandering on to go back and pick up everybody. So while he's doing that, he takes apart the typewriter that he has. One of the forensic analysis items that the FBI is looking at is what kind of typewriter all of this was written on. Every make and model have different fonts available. They strike in different ways. Kind of like teeth, they're all unique. They all work approximately the same way, but sometimes they're not in the right place. So Bill takes all the keys out of the typewriter and he drops them all in Lake Washington before they drive back to Spokane. They pick up Harmon, they pick up George, they have George blindfolded and hidden again. They end up getting near Issaquah near midnight. After midnight, they drop him off in the woods with a blanket and $1. They figured that since they found him and kidnapped him while he was walking home because he didn't want to wait for anybody, he was probably going to walk off again. So they're like, oh, no big deal. He can figure it out. He's 9. Like, he'll be getting a job soon. So he ends up actually walking off in search of a house to find help. And we have a hand annotated map. So for those of y'all who end up borrowing this book, these are photocopied out of it. So you can actually find the images. So we have a crossroads that one direction goes to Tiger Mountain and Renton. The other ones go out to Issaquah and then Maple Valley. Now, George got dropped off closest to Lewis Spar, and he lived in the midst of the woods. He had a job where he was a very sound sleeper because of the hard work that he was doing. George gets to the house, he knocks on the door a few times, no answer. He's like, okay, nobody's home, let me try another spot. So he keeps walking, finds his way to the main road, and he ends up on the Boniface farm. So this is a family of 6. They have a farm. They, are also kind of poor. They have an old pickup truck from the 1920s that they use as their farm vehicle. And they take him in, they feed him, they get him new socks and shoes, and they call in the fact that he showed up at the house and went, hi, I'm Georg Weyerhaeuser. Can you help me find my way back home? So they call the FBI, and then the FBI informs the family, and they arrange for pickup. So the Boniface family offers to drive him back to Tacoma. And this car is old. It doesn't go very fast. And so he's just chugging along, Mr. Boniface and George in the truck, and of course the press are on their tail because the press are just essentially glorified paparazzi at that point. So John Dreher hears about this and he gets this idea and he goes to a cab driver that he had been having drive him around and says, hey, I need you to drive me out to this, get there as fast as you can. He manages to speed and catch up and pass the truck and then turns around and stops them and goes to Mr. Boniface and goes, hey, I'm here to pick up George. I'll give you $5 for your trouble. So he gets George in the back of the cab, and John and George are in the back of the cab in the bottom, in the footwells, covered in a blanket. And John takes advantage of this by actually interviewing George and getting the scoop. So they end up driving back to the Weyerhaeuser home, and he ends up publishing first. So now that that's all over, the Whaleys decide that they are going to leave town. June 2nd, they return to the shack in Seattle where the ransom money is stored. They divvy it up, they figure out how they're going to do it, and Harmon has this great idea. Harmon says, hey, why don't we go back to Salt Lake City? And so he sends Margaret to find out how much a train to Ogden, Utah would cost, and got her on the train that morning out to Ogden. Her grandfather actually lived out there. And Harmon decided he was going to hide some of the money in Margaret's suitcase. And the way that he did this without her knowing was going, hey honey, I think I might want to put my ukulele in there for later. Like, just leave the bag open, I'll finish packing. And so Harmon buys the train tickets. He pays for a ticket to Boise on the same train. He then pays for a transfer ticket to Ogden with one of the $20 bills from the ransom money. Now, this is the same day that the FBI started mailing out all of those packets of all the serial numbers. The same day. So there's an overnight train. They end up in Ogden the next day. Margaret goes and visits her grandfather, Julius Thulin. And, she goes, hey, like, I'm expecting another bag to get delivered. Can we keep it at your house? So she leaves her bags at the house. She visits with her grandfather. And when Harmon gets into town, they end up in Salt Lake City. So Harmon sends Margaret out to buy some dishes because they just rented a place that has no cookware, nothing to eat off of, and they think they're gonna be there for a little while. So Margaret goes to one of the Five and Dimes. She buys a set of dishes with some of the marked bills. And that same day, Harmon goes out and buys a used Ford Roadster with $135. So it's not the newest or the shiniest, but it's just under $3,000 in today's money. So it's not that bad. The next day, Margaret goes and spends more of the ransom money in town. She's buying things, 10 cents here, 30 cents here, with $5 and $10 and $20 bills. And she ends up going and having lunch with her old schoolmate, Ida. And Ida and Margaret grew up poor. They were very poor. They had big families. Having that kind of money and showing off was not a thing that they were supposed to be doing. And Ida's questioning why she has money, but she's like, oh, well, I guess she's doing well. And Margaret ends up giving Ida a bunch of the money that she has on hand and going, here, let me help you out. So next day, Harmon and Margaret decide that they're gonna go driving around. They end up out at the Saltaire Amusement Park for a church social night with the Mormon church. And to give you context, the Saltaire is kind of like the Coney Island of Salt Lake City region. So it is the big deal place to go. It's good entertainment, and it is a social opportunity that is actually wholesome for the time. So next day, the Whaleys are starting to get caught. On the 7th, 9 of the marked bills end up getting reported to the FBI. The press is asked to remain quiet about it because they do not want to get their cover blown by the press. Same day, Bill ends up leaving one of the suitcases at the house of Margaret's grandfather. He shows up, he gives him another fake name, last name at Davis. Here, we've got a suitcase. And same day, also in that region, the federal agents who are opening up the Salt Lake City field office open the door and they find yet another note from the kidnappers. And it's more idle threats. It's more warnings of like, don't you interfere. You're not going to be able to catch us. Things are going to go badly. And they ended up going badly, but not for the right reasons. So next day, June 8th, Margaret goes to Harmon and she says, hey, my father's birthday's coming up and I'd like to buy him a gift. And so Harmon gives her some more money and she goes to Woolworth's and she picks out this lovely little cigarette case that only costs 20 cents. And she goes up to the cashier. She gives them a $5 bill, not realizing that it's one of the hot $5 bills. And so Woolworths back in the day did not have the cash register right where you were being rung up. They actually had all the money handling happening in a back room. The person that was helping her went to the back room and they had a copy of all the serial numbers. So they went through that list and found the serial number on the list. And so they call the Department of Justice. This is right nearby. So we end up having Detective William M. Rogers and Patrolman L.B. Gifford arrive at Woolworths. And they ask her, hey, did you end up spending this money here? Do you know where this $5 bill came from? We're gonna have to take you in. So they bring her to the FBI field office there. And around the same time, Harmon gets tired of waiting. So he drives home. He's like, whatever, she'll figure it out. Because this is just par for the course. Everybody is going, oh, they'll figure it out, it's fine. Nobody's in trouble. So he's at home. He realizes that he's gonna need to burn some evidence. So he burns a bunch of the paperwork, and then he realizes that they can only go so far with using this money. So he burns $3,700 in ransom money. Yeah, it's a lot of money that he just sent up in smoke. So around 2:45 p.m., agents end up arriving at the Whaley house, and Harmon is spotted because he has his middle name tattooed on his knuckles in 1935, when most people are not tattooed, not even in places that are not visible to the public. So, as I said before, people make lots of bad decisions in this story. Lots of them. So, on the 10th, Harmon ends up showing the FBI agents where he buried the rest of the ransom money that they shared, and it was in a place called Emigration Canyon. The total of their share was $90,700. A couple of days later, the Whaleys are held at the federal building in Salt Lake City, and they're considering the charge of mail fraud conspiracy, but they're also considering applying the Lindbergh kidnapping law. They end up going with the mail fraud conspiracy, and between June 19th and 26th, they go through hearing procedures. Harmon pleads guilty. He ends up getting a 45-year sentence and has to pay $20 to cover the cost of prosecutors showing up that day. So, and of course, Margaret, being the hopeful, idealistic person that she is, who is still firmly believing in her pledge to honor and obey and support her husband, she wants to plead guilty even though she had no idea what was going on the whole time. And it took 2 different lawyers to talk her out of pleading guilty. So she ends up pleading no contest. They have a trial. She's found guilty on 2 counts in violation of the Lindbergh kidnapping law, and she ends up serving a 20-year sentence at the U.S. detention farm in Milan, Michigan. Now, Harmon ends up in the same place as Bill eventually. So Bill finds out that all of this has happened. He gets the heck out of Dodge as soon as he can. He goes through several states. He is spending this money like crazy, knowing that he's not going to have very long before they catch him. They find his fingerprints at a bank robbery in South Dakota, of all places. And then he ends up in California, and he's going up and down the coast, spending money like crazy, and he's not considering where he's spending, what he's doing, and whether he uses any disguises. So on May 6th, his new landlady at the hotel that he booked in San Francisco goes across the street to the Justice Department and goes, hey, I've got this guy that's acting weird and he's kind of making my other hotel patrons nervous. I think this might be Bill. Might be the guy you're looking for. So, next day around noon, FBI shows up, they arrest Bill. He has $7,300 left of the ransom money on his person. He gets arrested, He's taken into custody. He is flown back to Tacoma on the 9th to await trial. At 10 a.m., he enters a guilty plea. He gets a 60-year sentence because of how much more he ended up doing. This is the brains of this whole wild operation. He's making dumb decisions, but he's older. He's supposed to be more responsible. He's trying to treat this like it's a professional outfit, but he has no idea what he's doing. So both Bill and Harmon end up at McNeil Island, which is a state hospital for the insane. It's in the Puget Sound. And then by 1939, he ends up getting moved to Alcatraz. So Harmon got moved to Alcatraz in 1936. And strangely enough, Harmon ends up meeting Al Capone there. So Al Capone worked in the laundry. This was the job that they gave people who just did not need to be out in general population. And Al Capone got in a few scuffles with Harmon. The second one happened in the band room, of all places, and Al Capone grabs his arm and tries to bite him. Yeah. So yeah, eventually Harmon ends up getting released. During all of the time that he's been incarcerated, he keeps writing letters to George and going, hey, I'm really sorry. Like, obviously, I'm not doing what I was supposed to do. I feel really bad about it. And once Harmon gets out, he's in his 50s and he needs a job. And Georg Weyerhaeuser gives him a job working for Weyerhaeuser. So,
what?
Yeah, really. Yeah, not an easy job, but at least, he was able to get a job after all of that. Bill got out of prison when he was 63, and, Margaret, once she got released, she actually got released early, I think about 15 years in, maybe 18. I'd have to check the book. She ends up moving back to Utah. She gets a divorce from Harmon as soon as she possibly can, and then she remarries. And she stays ahead of the law and out of trouble for the rest of her life and doesn't want to talk about it ever again. Yeah. Do y'all have any questions? I might be able to answer them.
How long was Bill in McNeil Island, the state mental hospital, and he didn't say what he was in there for?
That was just the place that they were holding them for the time being, because both of them ended up at McNeil Island first before they figured out where to transport them. Unfortunately, due to it crossing state lines and also prosecuting in Washington, they had to figure out, okay, where are we going to put these guys? Like, we can't keep them in the mental hospital forever. That's not going to work. Yes?
What happened to George as an adult?
So, George ended up becoming the CEO of the Weyerhaeuser Company for several decades. He actually spearheaded a lot of innovation within the lumber industry, a lot of moves towards sustainability. The Weyerhaeusers under his tutelage were on the Forbes 500 list. They're still on the Forbes 100 to this day. And he ended up figuring out how to salvage logs after Mount St. Helens erupted. So, he did a lot with the time that he had, and he was a pretty well-rounded and generous person. Unfortunately, George passed in 2022, so we just missed him.
But he was 95 years old.
Yes, Dana?
I heard that George thought that his having to deal with the press in the aftermath was more horrendous than the actual kidnapping.
Oh yeah, it's true. He was now a new celebrity. So, you know, the little girl neighbor wanted his autograph because it was more interesting and culturally valuable to her than some of the actual celebrities. And so you have all of these photo shoots, and you know, the press didn't leave their lawn for weeks afterward because they were so enthralled with the whole story. Yeah. Anyone else? All right. Well, that's it.